The creak of the floorboard under her heels was the same one I'd fixed 20 years ago, back when she still called me Mom. Still, I just sat there folding Logan's sweater, my hands slow, deliberate, like the truth hadn't just shattered in front of me. As her perfume filled the hallway, sharp, expensive, unfamiliar, I let the scent remind me how far she'd drifted. While she scrolled past me, talking about modern parenting, I remembered the girl who once begged me to fight for her. The same voice now said I was obsolete, a relic, and in that moment, I rewrote my will with a steadier hand than I raised her with. That's when I realized love isn't inheritance. It's the legacy you protect, not the one you pass down. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The sunlight slanted through the windows, casting a warm glow over the breakfast table, but the mood was anything but light. The air felt tight, as if something unspoken had settled between them, thick and heavy. The clink of silverware on plates was the only sound breaking the silence, until Dana's voice pierced it, cool and sharp. "We're not raising them by old rules, Mom." It was an offhand comment, but it landed with the weight of a stone hitting water. Dana's eyes didn't leave Ellen as she spoke, as if daring her to disagree. Ellen sat at the head of the table, her hands wrapped tightly around her coffee mug, her posture stiffening in response. She didn't answer right away, but the hardness in her eyes was unmistakable. Her gaze dropped to her plate, and for a moment, everything in the room seemed to hang on the delicate balance of what she would say next. Logan, sitting across from her, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The way his mother was holding herself, so still, so silent, made him uneasy. He glanced at her, then at Dana, then back again, feeling his face flush with discomfort. He wasn't sure what had just happened, but he could sense the widening gap between his parents and his mom's unwillingness to bend. It embarrassed him, this growing tension, and he couldn't find a way to make it go away. "Mom, it's fine," he murmured, the words small and tentative, like a lifeline thrown into a storm. He wanted to make it better, but he could feel the unspoken wall between them. The words came out half-heartedly, lacking the confidence they needed. Ellen didn't even glance up. Mark, sitting next to Dana, ran a hand through his hair, his face unreadable. "We're just doing things differently now," he said, shrugging lightly, as though the whole thing was trivial. But to Ellen, it wasn't. Her hands tightened around her napkin, and she began folding it in slow, deliberate motions. The sound of fabric rustling seemed to echo louder than it should have. She didn't respond to Mark's comment, didn't meet his eyes. Her silence was more eloquent than anything she could have said, and it stretched out in the room, thick and uncomfortable. Mark's shrug was casual, but Ellen's silence, her refusal to engage, was a rebellion of its own. She wasn't going to play along with this new version of parenting, this version that felt too detached, too modern. It was as if she was watching herself become irrelevant in the face of their new rules. Logan looked down at his plate, feeling trapped in the quiet intensity of the moment. He could sense his mother's anger without it being voiced, could feel it vibrating in the space between them. The table, once a familiar place of family conversation, now felt like a battleground. Ellen's eyes flickered to Dana's face, and for the briefest moment, something passed between them. Dana's expression was unreadable, but Ellen knew that this was about more than just Logan's manners. It was about a shift in the way they saw the world, and the way they saw her. With a small, deliberate movement, Ellen set her napkin down and pushed her chair back. She didn't say a word as she stood up, her back straight, her movements stiff and measured. Logan watched, his throat tight, his stomach churning. "Mom," he called out, but she didn't answer. Ellen disappeared into the other room, the sound of the door clicking shut behind her reverberating in the heavy silence. Mark and Dana exchanged a glance, but neither moved. It was as if they were waiting for something. Or perhaps they too felt the line had been drawn. The moment stretched, too thick to break, too thin to grasp. The soft click of the safe echoed in the silence of the room, louder than it should have been. Ellen stood before it, her fingers pressing against the cold metal door. It felt like a moment suspended in time, her thoughts churning with a weight she couldn't fully name. She had done this before, opened it countless times, but today felt different, more deliberate. Every motion felt heavy, as though the air itself was holding its breath. She pulled the door open slowly, the contents inside unchanged, untouched, just as she had left them. A stack of papers, neatly organized, all in their proper places. Ellen's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the top file. The deed to the house, still in her name. Her thumb traced the edge of the document, but her mind was elsewhere. The house was still hers, still anchored to her, but it wouldn't stay that way for long. Dana. She had always been the one Ellen intended to leave everything to. The trust, the savings, all of it. Her daughter was to be the sole heir. It was what she had planned, what she had always known to be right, even if the lines between them had shifted, frayed, and pulled taut in recent years. But now Ellen felt something inside her snap, something that had been building for weeks, months, maybe even years. Her eyes drifted to the next document, the savings account papers. Ellen plus Dana, joint signers. The thought of it made her stomach twist. The account was meant to be a backup, a safety net. But Dana had drifted further and further away, and Ellen couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something needed to change. That ends today, she whispered to herself, a quiet resolve settling over her. The words, simple yet final, carried a finality that cut through the static in her mind. She could feel it then. The shift. The break. The safe door slammed shut with a sharp sound, and she straightened up, her chest tightening with something like fear, something like determination. Her hand hovered over the phone on the desk nearby. She reached for it, dialing a number she knew by heart. Judith. She hadn't spoken to her in months, but now, it was time. Her finger hovered over the keypad, uncertainty making her pause. She had waited long enough. The message was short, direct. I'd like to meet. Privately. It was a calculated risk. Judith had always been pragmatic, businesslike. She would understand. She'd been waiting for this. Ellen was sure of it. The tension in the air seemed to grow heavier as she pressed send. She stared at the screen for a beat, waiting for the response to pop up, and when it finally did, her breath hitched. Judith's reply was immediate, almost too quick. Been waiting for that call? Ellen closed her eyes for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. This wasn't just about the estate, or the documents, or even Dana anymore. This was something deeper, something more urgent. She had waited for too long to act, allowed too much to slide by, but now, she would take control. Her hands shook as she set the phone down. She wasn't sure what would come next, but she knew that she was done waiting. The safe, the papers, Dana. It all felt so far away, like she was standing at the edge of something, about to jump. She wasn't sure if it would be a fall or a flight, but she knew she couldn't stay where she was. The room felt small suddenly, closing in on her. Her pulse raced, her thoughts scattered, but she stood still, waiting. For Judith's response, for whatever came next. And as the silence stretched on, Ellen could feel the weight of the line she had just drawn. There was no going back now. The door clicked shut behind her with a soft finality. Ellen stood in the doorway of Judith's office, taking in the familiar scent of aged paper and polished wood. The bookshelves, filled with hardcovers and legal tomes, seemed to close in around her, as if the space itself were waiting, holding its breath. Judith's office was always the same, immaculate and orderly. It was the kind of place that suggested control, precision, the kind of place Ellen needed right now. Judith was already seated behind her desk, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. Her posture was poised, but Ellen could see the flicker of curiosity in her eyes as she stood. She didn't move, waiting for Ellen to speak first. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with the unspoken words that had brought Ellen here today. Ellen set her purse down on the chair beside her, but didn't sit. Her fingers brushed the edge of the desk, tracing the grain of the wood, as if trying to ground herself. She felt the weight of the past few months pressing down on her decisions, on the things she had avoided saying for too long. Judith folded her hands in front of her, waiting. She knew Ellen well enough to give her space, knowing that she would speak when she was ready. Ellen took a deep breath, her chest tight, and then she looked up at Judith. "You're not mad. You're done," she said, her voice steady, but laced with something fragile. Judith's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes narrowing slightly, but her face remained neutral. She didn't speak immediately, choosing instead to let the words hang in the air between them, thick and heavy. Ellen nodded, almost imperceptibly. Exactly. There it was, the quiet admission, the recognition of a line that had been crossed, the frustration, the years of resentment, and the slow, quiet realization that what had once been a relationship, a bond, a promise, had dissolved into something else, something unrecognizable. Ellen felt it now, more clearly than ever. She wasn't angry with Dana. She wasn't even sad. She was done. Judith, ever the professional, didn't press. She simply motioned to the chair across from her, indicating Ellen should sit. When Ellen didn't immediately comply, Judith gave her a small, knowing nod. "Let's get down to it then." Ellen finally sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Judith opened a drawer and pulled out a thick file. It was the will. Ellen's will. The documents she had drafted years ago when things had felt different. The old version of herself. She watched as Judith laid the papers out on the desk in front of them, methodically flipping through the pages. The details were still the same. Dana was the sole beneficiary. Everything was supposed to go to her. But now, with every glance at the paper, Ellen could see how hollow that promise felt. Dana had become a stranger, and Ellen couldn't ignore the rift that had grown between them. Judith didn't comment on the will immediately. She simply tapped the papers, turning the pages with a measured precision. Ellen didn't expect her to. Judith knew better than to rush. After a long pause, Judith finally spoke, her voice smooth, but carrying the weight of understanding. "You've made changes. I can see that." Ellen swallowed hard. "I can't do it anymore, Judith. I can't leave it all to her when I don't even know her anymore." Judith was quiet for a moment, considering. Then she looked up, her eyes sharp. "We can draft something new, something more fitting for this shift. You need more than just a new beneficiary. You need something that reflects where you stand now." Ellen's breath hitched. "Moral conditions," she said quietly, the words forming as they left her mouth. It was an idea she'd had, a way to make sure Dana understood what she had lost. If she doesn't meet certain expectations, then what? The trust? The assets? They go elsewhere, to someone who gets it. Judith didn't flinch at the suggestion. That's a new kind of clause, a condition that ties her inheritance to her actions, to her values. Something that can't be ignored. Ellen's chest tightened at the thought, but also something else stirred. A sense of clarity, control. She had always thought of the inheritance as a simple matter of passing things on, but now it felt like more than that. It was a message, a statement of what she had endured, and what she refused to tolerate any longer. Judith began to scribble notes in the margins of the papers, her pen moving quickly, expertly. Ellen watched, feeling the room narrow around her as Judith worked, crafting something that would reshape everything. For a moment, Ellen felt a surge of hope, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. She was done being the passive participant in her own life. The line had been drawn, but now she would rewrite the rules entirely. And for the first time in a long time, Ellen felt like she was taking back control. The pen felt heavy in Ellen's hand, its familiar weight a stark contrast to the weight of what she was about to do. Her fingers trembled slightly as she hovered above the page, the legal document in front of her now a symbol of finality. It was as if the words written on the paper would define not just the distribution of assets, but the end of something far deeper, the end of the person she had been, the mother she had tried to be, and the daughter she had once hoped to shape. Judith, seated across from her, gave her a steady, professional look. She didn't hurry Ellen, didn't rush the process. She simply waited, knowing the significance of what was about to happen. The silence stretched between them, thick with the gravity of this moment. Ellen's eyes moved down the page, her gaze settling on Dana's name, the one she had written in years ago as the sole beneficiary. But now, that name felt foreign, like a vestige of a past that had faded too far. Slowly, Ellen drew a line through the name, feeling the resistance of the pen against the paper, a resistance she had not anticipated. It felt like erasing a part of herself, a part of her history. But in that same moment, it also felt necessary. She paused, her breath catching in her chest. Dana, her own flesh and blood, was no longer her primary heir. The realization settled like ice in her veins. But what was the alternative? Bailey's name replaced Dana's, a name that had come into Ellen's life by accident, but had stayed by choice. Bailey, the young woman whose resilience reminded Ellen of herself at that age. Bailey, who was trying to make something of herself despite all the odds. Ellen felt a surge of protectiveness as she wrote her name. Bailey would inherit, but only if she met a condition, a challenge, a 25-year clause. The words spilled onto the page as if they had always belonged there. Must complete college or trade school. Ellen paused again, the pen still in her hand. She'd once believed that Dana would be the one to rise to the challenge of responsibility. But now she saw that it wasn't enough to simply pass on the legacy. That was why Bailey needed this. Structure. A reason to strive. Next came Logan's name. Her son, the one who had always been caught in the middle, who had never asked for any of the tension between his parents. His name was not for money or inheritance, but for something far more intangible. A behavior clause, respectful conduct maintained. It was simple, but it was important. Logan, for all his quiet discomfort at family gatherings, needed to know that the way he treated the world mattered, not just as a child, but as a person in her eyes. Then there was Claire Yuen. She had always been a quiet force in Ellen's life, her calm presence a counterbalance to the chaos that often surrounded her. Claire was appointed as the secondary guardian, someone who would watch over Bailey and Logan, someone who would ensure that the children didn't fall through the cracks if things ever went wrong. If Ellen's control slipped away, Claire would be there to keep things steady. And then, the final line, the hardest one to write. Dana removed from home inheritance. Her heart tightened as she wrote the words, the pen moving in slow, deliberate strokes. The home that had once been a symbol of family, of unity, of warmth, was no longer for Dana. It was the hardest line to write, the hardest truth to face. Dana had abandoned her, and Ellen had no choice but to accept it. When the final line was written, Ellen sat back, staring at the paper in front of her. It looked so simple, but the weight of the changes, the shifts, the decisions, it was crushing. She had rewritten everything, rewritten her entire life, her legacy. This was no longer just a will, it was a statement. Judith leaned forward, her eyes scanning the document with practiced ease. She didn't offer praise, didn't offer judgment. Instead, she simply nodded, her gaze flicking up to meet Ellen's. You just rewrote every room she stands in. Ellen swallowed, her throat dry. The words felt like a slap, but they were true. Dana would never step into the same house again, never feel the same way about anything that had once been hers. Ellen had taken it all away, and in doing so, had taken back her own sense of control. Ellen looked down at the paper again. The pen rested beside it, the ink now dry. It was done. The finality of it sank in. And yet, she didn't feel the relief she expected. Instead, the weight of what she had done pressed on her chest like a stone, leaving her breathless. What had she become? And what would she do next? The room seemed to close in on her, the walls narrowing. Ellen had crossed a line, but the future felt darker, uncertain, as if it were filled with shadows of what she had left behind. The pen hovered in Ellen's hand once again, but this time it wasn't for any mere signature. The weight of what she was about to do felt monumental. The papers in front of her weren't just a revision of the will, they were the closing chapter of a life she had once known. A life that felt like it belonged to someone else now. As she signed each document, final POA, medical directives, and the estate plan, each stroke of the pen felt like severing another tie to the past, another piece of her former identity. The will had been rewritten. The beneficiaries had shifted. Bailey's name was now etched in permanent ink, and Dana's was nowhere to be found. It was done. The finality of it settled into her bones, but there was no comfort in that. No solace. The decision to remove Dana was not an easy one, but it was the only one left. Dana's actions had made it clear. The bond that once tied them had snapped beyond repair. Ellen set the pen down slowly, her fingers lingering on the paper as if she could still feel the weight of the choices she had made. With a sigh, she gathered the documents and slid them into an envelope. She didn't hesitate as she walked to Judith's desk, placing the folder with the revised papers into a fireproof lockbox. It was a silent, ritualistic act, securing her decisions in a place where no one, not even Dana, could reach them. It felt like the last move in a long game, one that had drained her more than she had realized. Judith didn't speak at first. She simply nodded, a look of quiet understanding passing between them. There was nothing more to say. The legalities had been finalized. Ellen had done what needed to be done. The future, uncertain and jagged, now had a clear path, one paved with the absence of someone she had once loved. Later that afternoon, when Ellen was alone in her home, she received a call from Dana. Her voice, tentative at first, crackled through the line. "Mom, I need help with camp money. Can you—" Ellen's chest tightened. The request, so casual, so familiar, sounded like it came from a different lifetime, a time when Dana's needs had been her priority. She swallowed the words that threatened to spill out. The truth was, she didn't want to help. She couldn't help. Without missing a beat, Ellen answered, her voice flat, almost cold. "Ask your new rules for help." A beat of silence on the other end of the line. Dana's voice faltered. "What's that supposed to mean?" Ellen didn't hesitate, her words cutting through the static. "It means you're on your own now, Dana. Ask the rules I set for you. Ask the conditions. That's what they're there for." Another pause, longer this time. Ellen could hear the crackling frustration on the other end, the shock, the confusion. But she wasn't going to back down. She had made her choice. And it wasn't a choice she was going to regret. Dana's voice broke through the silence, quieter this time. "Fine, I'll figure it out." Ellen didn't respond, the phone feeling heavy in her hand. Her heart was a tight knot, but she knew. This was the end. There would be no turning back from this, no going back to the way things were. Dana was no longer her responsibility. She had crossed that line, and there was no erasing it now. Ellen dropped the phone onto the table, her hand shaking slightly. She felt something cold, something final, settle in her chest. It wasn't relief, but a realization. The house, the will, the new rules. It all felt like a house of cards, fragile and easily toppled, yet impossibly sturdy in its final form. The future was already written. But what came next? The letter was folded neatly, its edges crisp from the press of her fingers. Ellen sat in the kitchen, staring at the envelope in front of her. The words she had written inside were final, cutting through the silence of the room like a blade. Dana's name had been removed from the will, from the POA, from all access to the inheritance. The finality of it still unsettled her, but the decision had been made. Ellen didn't bother reading it over again. She had read it too many times, the words becoming a steady pulse in her mind. She had written it carefully, with the same precision she had used to draft every legal document, every choice that led to this moment. It was all laid out. She didn't expect an answer, not one that would satisfy her. But she knew it had to be done. She took the letter to her front door, the weight of it heavy in her hands, and placed it on the counter with a small, deliberate movement. Ellen had always imagined that Dana's response would be one of surprise, of shock. But this, she knew, would be different. Dana would scream. Dana would be angry. And Ellen was ready for it. The phone rang just as the letter left her hand. Ellen didn't flinch as she reached for it, the familiar sound of her daughter's voice crackling through the line before the first word even left her lips. "You can't do this!" Dana's voice was a jagged scream, raw with anger and disbelief. "What the hell is wrong with you? How could you take everything from me?" Ellen's breath caught for a moment, but she didn't let it shake her. She knew this would come, the explosive fury. This was the price of what she had done. "I'm not angry, Dana," Ellen said calmly, her voice a soft but unwavering contrast to the chaos on the other end. "I'm done." There was a breathless pause on the other end, the silence thick with Dana's seething rage. "You've taken everything I ever wanted. You've ruined everything." Ellen closed her eyes, leaning back against the kitchen counter, her chest tight. "I didn't ruin it. You did that, long before I wrote this letter." There was a ragged sound from the other side of the phone, a sob, a curse, then silence. And then, "How could you? After everything? After all these years?" Ellen felt something deep inside her tighten. "I did it because you wanted something that couldn't be given. You wanted me to pretend things hadn't changed. I couldn't do that anymore. Not for you. Not for anyone." The words hung in the air like a thick fog, settling between them in the quiet aftermath of the storm. Before Dana could respond, there was another voice on the line. Mark's. "Ellen?" His voice was cautious, like he was testing the waters, unsure of where this would go. "Did you go too far?" Ellen sat up straighter, the tension in her shoulders releasing just a little. The question stung, but she didn't let it show. "You tell me," she said, her voice even. "What did she say about old rules?" There was a long pause before Mark answered. "You don't have to—" "I did what I had to do," Ellen interrupted, her words steady now. "And I didn't fight. I wrote." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken emotions. Mark's voice softened. "But she's your daughter." Ellen's eyes narrowed as she looked at the letter again, her hand clenching into a fist. "And she showed me she's no longer mine." Just then, Ellen's phone buzzed again. It was Judith. She had heard from the legal team, and her confirmation was as clinical as ever. "Ellen," she said, "the legality is airtight. Everything is in place. The changes are solid." Ellen closed her eyes, leaning back into the chair. She let the words settle over her breath still coming a little too fast. The letter had been delivered. It was done. She wasn't sure if it made her feel stronger or weaker, but she knew that nothing, no one, would change her mind now. The phone went silent for a moment, and Ellen was left with the echo of her decisions. She had drawn the line, and the question now wasn't whether Dana would cross it. It was whether Ellen would be able to live with what she had done. And as she sat there, the weight of her choices hung heavier than the silence. The room was cold, sterile. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights above punctuated the silence as Ellen sat in the chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She hadn't hesitated when the suggestion was made. She had agreed to the cognitive evaluation without a second thought. There was no question in her mind that she was fully capable. What she didn't anticipate was how the weight of the test would feel as she faced it, alone. Dr. Sutton, a composed man in his mid-50s, sat across from her, his pen poised over a notepad. He hadn't asked for this session. It had been requested. Still, he was professional, attentive, as if the reason behind her presence didn't matter to him. His job was simple: to evaluate, to measure, to confirm what Ellen already knew. "Ready to begin?" he asked, his tone neutral but gentle, the kind of voice that suggested this was just another day at the office for him. Ellen nodded, not offering a smile. She didn't need to be reassured. She had long since made peace with her own mind, even if others hadn't. The next hour was a blur of questions, scenarios, and puzzles. Her mind, sharp and steady, worked through each with the clarity of a woman who had spent decades fine-tuning her intellect. She answered every question methodically, without pause, recalling details with perfect accuracy. A memory once honed by the years of raising children and managing her life came back to her with fluid ease. At one point, Dr. Sutton asked her to recall an intricate sequence of numbers backward. She did so without faltering, her voice calm and confident, every digit intact. He scribbled something on his notepad, glancing up at her with a raised eyebrow, though he didn't comment. The logic puzzles followed: patterns, shapes, sequences, each one falling into place as if her brain were a machine designed for such tasks. When the test ended, Dr. Sutton closed his notebook with a deliberate motion. He looked at her, then at the results. There was no hesitation in his voice when he spoke. "You've passed every section with flying colors. 100% recall. Perfect logic trail." He leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "Fully capable. Highly intentional." Ellen exhaled, the tension in her chest lifting slightly, though it didn't fully dissipate. She hadn't needed the confirmation, but somehow, hearing the words from a professional made them feel more solid, more real. She hadn't lost her mind. She hadn't faltered in the decision she'd made. She had done what needed to be done, with clarity and purpose. As she stood to leave, she felt the weight of the paper in her hands, the signed document, confirming her mental acuity, her autonomy. She didn't need anyone else to tell her she was capable. But the formality of it, the legalities of it, it felt necessary. Later, when she returned home, Dana was already waiting for her. The tension was palpable, thick in the air as Dana stormed into the room, eyes blazing. "So this is your plan? To pretend you're in control?" She spat, her voice dripping with anger and resentment. Ellen didn't flinch. "I don't need to pretend, Dana. I've always been in control, and I always will be." Mark stood in the doorway, silent. His eyes flickered between Ellen and Dana, but he said nothing. He had nothing to say. Logan, however, was different. He stepped forward, his small body hesitant at first but full of warmth. He wrapped his arms around Ellen tightly, as if offering her the protection she didn't ask for but desperately needed. "I know you're smart, Grandma," he whispered into her ear. Ellen's eyes softened and she returned the embrace, her heart aching just a little. She kissed his hair, breathing in the scent of him, the innocence she was trying so hard to preserve. "I know you know," she murmured softly, pulling back just enough to look him in the eye. "That's why you're still in the will." Logan gave a small, contented smile, his eyes gleaming with understanding far beyond his years. Ellen watched him for a moment longer, then turned to face the room. Dana's furious expression remained. But it was no longer her words that made the silence so heavy. It was the gap between what she wanted and what Ellen had given. She had drawn a line, and Dana would have to face the consequences. Ellen had passed the test, not just the cognitive one, but the test of her resolve, of her ability to hold on to herself. And now, the question lingered. Would Dana ever understand why she had done it? Would anyone ever truly understand? The soft click of the keyboard echoed through the room, punctuating the silence that had become almost too familiar in recent weeks. Ellen's fingers moved deliberately, each word a measured stroke against the blank page that lay before her. She had made the decision to put it all down, to frame the things that had been weighing on her heart for so long, her values, her principles. These were the rules now. The rules that would govern how her family operated, what was expected of them. She paused, rereading the first sentence. Respect first. It seemed simple enough, yet it was the foundation of everything. The past months had stripped away any illusion of harmony, and Ellen knew now that if respect didn't come first, everything else would crumble. She moved to the next line, kindness before cleverness. Another simple truth. Cleverness had too often been used as a shield, a way to hide behind words rather than actions. Kindness, however, was something you gave freely, without a second thought. It wasn't about winning arguments, it was about understanding, about human connection. She knew, deep down, that this was the quality that had been missing, that had caused the rift between her and Dana. Cleverness had won out time and again, and look where it had left them. The last line. Gratitude is daily. She didn't need to think about this one. It was a quiet plea, an offering of grace for both herself and others. Gratitude had been a thread running through her life, but it was easy to forget in the face of so many battles. It was easy to lose sight of when you were consumed by what you thought you deserved. Ellen had learned that the hard way. After a final glance over the page, she stood, the paper still in her hands, and framed it. The glass clicked into place with a soft snap, and she hung the framed values statement on the wall in the living room, right where it could be seen by anyone who entered. It was no longer enough to simply tell them what mattered. It needed to be visible, a constant reminder of the standards she had set. The standards that, despite everything, she believed in. Bailey walked into the room just as Ellen was stepping back, admiring the placement. She stopped, her eyes catching the framed statement. Slowly, she walked over, reading the words aloud, her voice soft but sure. Respect first, kindness before cleverness, gratitude is daily. Ellen's heart warmed slightly as she watched Bailey's eyes move from the paper to her, the silent acknowledgement in her expression giving her a quiet sense of relief. Bailey didn't need to be told how to behave. She already understood. There was a bond between them that hadn't fractured, no matter how difficult the past had been. Logan, who had been playing nearby, looked up and smiled when he saw the framed paper. "I like it," he said, his voice bright, his innocence carrying a weight of its own. Ellen smiled back at him, her gaze softening. "That's how you stay in the circle," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Logan's smile widened and he nodded as though the rules, simple, clear, made perfect sense to him. Then, from across the room, Dana's voice broke through the quiet. She stood with her arms crossed, eyes narrowed, her lips curled in a tight sneer. "Controlling till the end," she muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Ellen didn't flinch. She knew what Dana would say. She had known for a long time that Dana would never understand the things that mattered most to her. Dana had always been quick to dismiss anything that didn't fit her narrative, her sense of entitlement. But this time, Ellen wasn't about to back down. She wasn't going to apologize for the rules she had set, for the way she had drawn her boundaries. Dana's eyes flashed with a mixture of frustration and disbelief, and Ellen could almost feel the words she was holding back. Words meant to tear her down, to push her to the edge. But Ellen didn't look away. She stood firm, unyielding. She had already made her peace with this, with the fact that not everyone would agree with her choices. Bailey glanced at Dana, then back to Ellen, her expression softening. Logan, too, seemed to sense the weight in the air, his small hand resting on the back of Ellen's chair as if to say, "We're here. We understand." Ellen's gaze remained steady, her heart a steady thrum in her chest. "Let it be, Dana," she said quietly. "If you want to be part of this family, you know the rules." The silence that followed was thick, heavy with unspoken things. Dana's face twisted, torn between anger and something else, something she didn't want to admit. But she didn't speak again. Not right away. Ellen turned back to the framed statement on the wall, letting it anchor her. She had made her stand. The words were clear now, not just for Dana, but for everyone who would walk through her door. The rules were posted, and no one would be able to ignore them again. The ink was still fresh when Ellen signed the final page. The trust, an ironclad document, sat in front of her, thick, official, and completely unbreakable. It wasn't just an inheritance. It wasn't just money or assets. It was a promise. A promise to Bailey and Logan, her two constants in a world that had become increasingly fragile. Ellen had always believed in the power of education. It was what had kept her grounded through the years, what had given her strength when everything else seemed to falter. Now she had turned that belief into something more permanent, something that could not be undone, no matter how hard anyone tried. She had created a restricted education trust for both of them, a fund that would only be accessible for their schooling, college, trade school, whatever path they chose. They would never want for opportunity. But more importantly, it was hers alone to control. Dana could not touch it. Dana could not contest it. Dana could not change a single word, no matter how hard she tried. The thought of Dana's inevitable reaction twisted in Ellen's stomach, but she didn't let it show. This was for them. For Bailey and Logan. And that was what mattered most now. Later that evening, Mark found her sitting in the living room, her gaze fixed on the framed values statement she had posted just days before. He stood in the doorway, looking torn, concerned, yet defensive. "Ellen," he began, his voice careful as though testing the waters. "I don't think you fully understand what you're doing. This—" She didn't let him finish. "I understand exactly what I'm doing," she replied, her voice steady but firm. She reached for the folder on the coffee table, the one she had placed there earlier, and handed him a copy of the trust's rules. The papers were simple, but the weight of them was undeniable. Mark's eyes flicked over the document quickly, but he didn't speak right away. Ellen watched him closely, waiting for the words she knew were coming. "You can't just—" He stopped himself, looking up from the papers and meeting her gaze. "You're taking it too far. This isn't the way to handle things, Ellen." She shook her head, her lips pressing together in a tight line. "I'm not trying to control anyone, Mark. I'm trying to protect them." The words hung in the air, and for a long moment, there was only the faint sound of their breathing, mingling with the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. She hadn't expected Mark to understand. She hadn't even expected him to approve, but she had done it anyway. She had drawn the line, and this was the way she would protect them, even if no one else saw it. Mark let out a breath, running his hand through his hair. Frustration and concern painted across his face. He didn't reply immediately, instead folding the papers back up and setting them on the table with a quiet sigh. He had nothing more to say. The trust was done. Ellen had made sure of it. Ellen picked up the folder again, her fingers tracing the edges of the paper as if to reassure herself that it was real. The trust had been filed with the state. It was official now. It couldn't be changed. Not by Dana, not by anyone. It was locked in place. When Judith called the next morning, her voice was as assured as ever. "It's unbreakable," she said, the words familiar but no less solid. "Just like you." Ellen leaned back in her chair, her hand still resting on the folder. There was no turning back now. The future for Bailey and Logan was set in stone. For the first time in a long time, Ellen felt a sense of peace settle over her. It wasn't relief. Not quite. But it was something close. Something that felt like a foundation under her feet again. But the silence that followed Judith's words wasn't comforting. It was heavy. Too heavy. Ellen's phone buzzed suddenly, slicing through the quiet. It was a message from Dana. Ellen didn't look at it. She couldn't. But she knew what was coming. The line had been drawn, and the consequences of this decision were far from over. The trust, the protection, it was all in place. But the question remained. What would Dana do now? Ellen took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the papers. It was done. But for how long? How long would she be able to hold on to the fragile peace she had created? The future loomed ahead, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could shield herself from what was coming next. The campus was quieter than Ellen expected. The fall air crisp and still as she walked beside Bailey. The buildings were old, ivy creeping up the stone walls, but the vibrant energy of the students was palpable. It felt like the kind of place where dreams could be shaped, where futures could be rewritten. Ellen glanced down at Bailey, her young face lit with curiosity and awe as she took in the expanse of the school. Bailey's hand brushed against Ellen's as they walked, a small gesture that felt so simple. But to Ellen, it meant everything. She had fought for this moment, fought for Bailey's future in a way that no one else seemed to understand. They paused in front of a large stone fountain, its waters still as a reflection of the blue sky above. Bailey turned to Ellen, her expression serious for a moment, like she was piecing something together. "Why did Mommy say you're mad at us?" she asked softly. Ellen felt a tightness in her chest at the question. She had expected this, knew it would come, but it still hurt. Bailey was young, and her understanding of everything was still so innocent, so untainted. Ellen knelt down to her level, her voice steady, though her heart ached as she spoke. "Never at you, sweetheart," she said, her hand gently brushing Bailey's cheek. "I'm not mad at you. I'm just putting the right things in place, things that will protect you. Always." Bailey's eyes seemed to search Ellen's face for a moment. Then her small hand grasped Ellen's and she smiled, the tension melting from her features. "I know, Grandma," Bailey said, her voice small but sure. Ellen stood back up, taking in the campus again, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a deep sense of peace. This was right. This was the future she had worked for, the one she had fought so hard to secure. Later, after the tour, as they sat in the quiet warmth of the car, Ellen made another call. She added Claire as the backup trustee to the trust. It felt like the final step, ensuring that if anything were to happen to her, Bailey and Logan would always be in capable hands. It was a decision she had considered carefully. Claire, calm and steady, the perfect counterpart to her own determination. When she hung up the phone, The weight of it all hit her again. This was her legacy, the choices she had made. There was no turning back. And for the first time, she felt that she was truly giving them a chance at something better. Later that evening, Ellen sat at the kitchen table, sifting through the small stack of papers that had accumulated. Logan entered the room with something in his hand, a small folded piece of paper. Without a word, he walked over and handed it to her, his face shy but proud. Ellen unfolded the card, her fingers brushing over the neat handwriting. It was a thank you card, unprompted. No occasion needed. Just a simple message from Logan. Thank you for making everything better. I love you. Her throat tightened as she read it again. The weight of this small gesture, the unspoken bond between them, filled her with a quiet, overwhelming love. She tucked the card into her wallet, where it felt safe, a symbol of everything she was fighting for. The future was still uncertain. Ellen didn't know what Dana would do next, or how things would unfold in the months to come. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel the gnawing fear of losing control. She had done what she could. She had secured a future for her grandchildren, one that would be filled with opportunity, with hope, with the things she knew mattered. As the night drew in, Ellen stood in the quiet of her living room, the framed values statement still hanging on the wall. She had made the rules. She had set the path. But the question still lingered. Would it be enough to protect them from what was coming next? The no contest clause sat at the bottom of the final amendment, an additional line that made everything fall into place. The words were precise, unwavering, clear. If Dana contests any term of this trust, she forfeits all rights to her inheritance. It was simple, but it carried the kind of weight Ellen needed. Final, unyielding, irrefutable. Ellen read the clause again, her eyes tracing each word with a quiet satisfaction. She hadn't come to this decision lightly. The no contest clause was her final safeguard, her way of ensuring that Dana couldn't challenge what she had set in motion. If Dana tried to tear it all down, she would lose everything, every last bit of what Ellen had worked so hard to create. There would be no second chances. It wasn't about punishment. It wasn't even about control. It was about making sure her grandchildren's future remained intact, no matter what. The clause was a protective measure, not just for the trust, but for Bailey and Logan. They deserved to have their chance without the shadows of past mistakes hanging over them. Judith had already filed it with the final amendment. Ellen had heard the confirmation in Judith's voice earlier that morning. Calm, assured. It's done. It's official. And it was. The fireproof folder Ellen kept locked in the cabinet now contained everything. Every legal safeguard, every clause, every rule that would secure their futures. Later, Ellen found herself sitting at the kitchen table with the folder in front of her, her fingers resting lightly on the top of it. Bailey came in, her face lighting up as she noticed the folder. She tilted her head, curiosity sparkling in her eyes. "What's this folder for?" she asked, stepping closer. Ellen met her gaze, her voice soft, but steady. "It's how Grandma keeps promises," she said, her fingers brushing the edge of the folder as she spoke. Bailey nodded, not fully understanding but trusting the weight of her words. There was an innocence in her expression, a quiet certainty that she was safe. Ellen felt a flicker of relief at that, a quiet assurance that Bailey would grow up knowing stability, even if the world around them remained uncertain. Logan entered the room then, his small frame framed by the doorway, and he glanced at the folder too. His smile was small but understanding, a reflection of something deeper, something that transcended the words Ellen had written and signed. The family was together, in this small moment, and Ellen couldn't help but feel the weight of what she'd done to keep them that way. She had drawn the line, set the path, and now all she could do was hold her breath and wait. But the peace she had fought for was fragile, and she knew that all of this, The rules, the trust, the no contest clause could be upended in an instant. Her phone buzzed on the counter, slicing through the quiet. Ellen's heart skipped a beat as she glanced down at the screen. It was an email notification from Judith. The subject line made her stomach twist. Dana needs to talk. Ellen stared at it for a long moment, a knot forming in her chest. She didn't need to open it to know what Dana would say. She could already hear the anger in her voice, the challenge that was bound to come. But this time, there would be no second guessing. No room for negotiation. The rules had been set. Ellen slowly picked up the phone and read the message. "We need to talk." And as she put the phone down, she knew. This was it. The storm she had been preparing for had arrived. The future she had worked to secure was about to face its first real test. The doorbell rang just after the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the house in a dull, golden light. Ellen knew who it was before she even heard the chime. She had been waiting for this moment, the inevitable confrontation, the test she had been bracing for. Dana. Her hand lingered on the doorknob for a moment, fingers tight around the brass. But she didn't hesitate. She opened the door slowly, her expression neutral but her heart already heavy. There stood Dana, her face twisted with a mixture of defiance and desperation, eyes red-rimmed, but burning with an intensity Ellen knew all too well. Dana didn't wait for an invitation. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the space between them. "Just talk to me." Ellen stood firm, not stepping back, not letting herself be drawn into the old dance they'd once done. She had made her decisions, and there was no going back now. "You made your stance," Ellen said, her voice steady, calm despite the storm raging just behind Dana's words. "I made mine. You don't like old rules? Then don't live under them." The words felt like they had been waiting on the tip of her tongue for too long, and now that they were out, they settled into the space between them like a final statement. Dana recoiled, her eyes narrowing, as if the door she had been banging on for so long had finally slammed shut in her face. "You don't get it," Dana spat, her voice rising. "You think this is just about control. It's about everything you've taken from me, everything you've kept away. You think I don't deserve a say?" Ellen's gaze hardened and she took a small step back. "No, Dana. It's about protection. The rules are the only thing keeping this family from falling apart. You think it's control? It's not. It's the only thing left to hold on to." Her voice dropped, quiet but resolute. "I'm done letting you tear it down." There was a long, pregnant pause, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Dana's jaw clenched, her lips trembling with the effort of holding back more words that would only hurt. She knew this was her last chance, and she wasn't sure what to do with it. The silence between them stretched on, suffocating. Ellen's hand hovered over the door, her fingers tightening just a little. She had made her point. The line had been drawn, and Dana wasn't crossing it. Not anymore. Without another word, Ellen closed the door gently but firmly, the soft click of the latch, a quiet punctuation mark to the conversation they'd never have. She didn't look back, didn't wait for the anger to continue. The decision had been made, and now it was done. Ellen turned, exhaling deeply, the weight lifting just a little. She hadn't expected Dana to understand, but she had needed to make it clear that the past was over, that her patience had run out. Through the window, she saw Logan sitting in the car in the driveway, his small figure pressed against the window, watching silently. His face was unreadable, but Ellen could see the question in his eyes. He was old enough to understand some things, but not yet enough to know how heavy they could be. She raised her hand and waved at him, not to Dana, not to the storm outside, but to the boy who would one day understand the sacrifices she had made. The simple gesture, the quiet reassurance, was all she had to offer him right now. Logan waved back, A small, tentative smile spreading across his face, his eyes shining with a quiet understanding. But Ellen's heart still ached. The future she had fought for was real, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part was still to come. She turned away from the window, her hand still resting on the door, feeling the weight of the choices she had made and the silence that followed them. The storm outside had only just begun. The soft rustle of paper in Judith's office was the only sound as Ellen placed the final binder on the desk. The binder that contained every decision, every carefully drawn line, every choice Ellen had made for the future. The trust, the rules, the safeguards. All of it was wrapped up in this one final document. This was the culmination of everything she had fought for, and now it was time to seal it. Judith sat across from her hands steady as she reached for the binder. Ellen didn't need to be told that this was it. The final step. The moment everything became irreversible. The words she had spent so long drafting, every clause, every protection. Now, it would all become permanent. "There's one more thing," Ellen said, her voice steady but thick with emotion as she pulled out an envelope from her bag. She placed it on the desk in front of Judith. Inside was a personal letter, her final message to her grandchildren, Bailey and Logan. Judith looked at it for a moment, then back at Ellen, her eyebrows raised slightly. She didn't question it. There was no need to. She knew how important this was. Ellen's fingers lingered on the envelope. "I've added something personal, a letter for both of them. I want them to know why I did this, what it means, that no matter what happens, they understand." Judith nodded, her expression softening. She didn't need to read the letter to know its weight. Ellen had done everything for them, the future of her family. But this was different. This was her heart in writing. After a long moment, Judith took the envelope and slid it into the binder. The binder was now complete. No more edits, no more changes. It was sealed. The future Ellen had crafted was now unchangeable, except for the final steps she had to take to ensure its safety. Ellen sat back in her chair, her breath a little deeper now, as if the weight she had carried was starting to lift. This was the moment, the final piece. "Let's file it," Judith said quietly, lifting the binder from the desk. "It'll be officially in the legal vault." Ellen nodded, a quiet acceptance settling in her chest. She didn't say anything more, just followed Judith as they walked toward the back of the office, where the vault waited. It was a sterile, almost cold place, but to Ellen, it felt like a final home for everything she had worked for. The words in that binder weren't just legal terms, they were her legacy, a map for Bailey and Logan to follow, even when she wasn't there to guide them. As Judith filed the binder, Ellen's thoughts turned inward, to the final change she had yet to make. Her home. The place she had spent so many years building, the place that had become the heart of her family. Once Judith had returned, Ellen pulled out another piece of paper, the deed to the house. She took a deep breath before sliding the document toward Judith. "Change the title. It's going to Bailey." Judith didn't need to ask why. She understood. She signed the document with a quick motion, her pen gliding across the paper, transferring ownership with the same finality that the rest of Ellen's decisions had held. "And Dana?" Judith asked softly, already knowing the answer. "Blocked," Ellen said with conviction. "She can't touch it. Not now. Not ever." For a moment there was a silence between them, thick with the weight of everything that had been done. Ellen didn't feel relief yet. She wasn't sure if she would, but she did feel something close to peace. The future was secured. No one, not even Dana, could undo it. But as Ellen gathered her things to leave, the quiet buzz of her phone caught her attention. A message. From Dana. Ellen's heart skipped a beat as she opened it. "I know what you've done. You can't keep me out forever. I'll fight you for it." Ellen stared at the message, her hand tightening around the phone. For a moment, time seemed to stretch out before her. The storm wasn't over. It had only just begun. Ellen walked slowly through her home, the house she had once thought of as a fortress, now feeling oddly empty. The walls, once alive with laughter and conflict, now seemed quieter, softer. She passed through the living room, where the framed value statement still hung. Respect first. Kindness before cleverness. Gratitude is daily. They were the rules, her rules, and they had been fought for with everything she had. But now, in the stillness of the house, it wasn't the rules that weighed on her. It was the absence, the space where things used to be, the echoes of past conversations that had grown fainter with each passing day. She made her way to the kitchen, the same place where she had spent countless hours baking, cooking, laughing with family. The countertops gleamed in the sunlight, polished and spotless. But the warmth of the space was missing. It wasn't just the quiet. It was the absence of the people she had fought for. The absence of the family she had hoped to keep together. Bailey's voice broke through her thoughts as the little girl bounded into the kitchen, a smile on her face as she held out an old, familiar cookbook. "Grandma, can we bake something from this?" she asked, her eyes wide with excitement. Ellen felt her heart swell, and for the first time in what felt like ages, she smiled with true warmth. "Of course we can, sweetheart," Ellen replied, her voice soft but filled with affection as she opened the book to a page she'd seen 100 times before. They worked together, Bailey's small hands helping as they mixed the ingredients, their laughter filling the space once again. It wasn't the kind of joy that filled the entire house. It was quieter, more intimate, but it was enough. Later that afternoon, Logan wandered into the kitchen, wiping his hands on his jeans as he held up a small tool. "Grandma, can I fix the garden gate? It's a little loose," he said, his expression serious as he surveyed the broken latch. Ellen felt a pang of something deep in her chest. Logan had always been the quieter one, the one who noticed the small details, the things that others might miss. His offer to help was more than just a simple fix. It was an unspoken promise that, despite everything, he was still there. Still present. "Of course you can, Logan," she said, her voice catching slightly as she followed him out into the garden. The air was cool, but the sunlight was warm against her skin as she watched him work. The sound of the wrench tightening the screws was the only noise that filled the space, but it felt grounding, like the earth was still holding them, still tethering them to something solid. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the yard, Ellen stood back and watched Logan finish the repair. He wiped his hands on his shirt, turning to her with a small, proud smile. "It's fixed," he said, his voice filled with quiet confidence. Ellen stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Still think these rules are old?" she asked gently, her eyes soft as she looked down at him. Logan looked up at her, a thoughtful expression crossing his face before he smiled again. "They're the only ones that make sense," he said, his words carrying more weight than his young years should have allowed. Ellen felt something inside her stir at his words, a mixture of pride and relief. Maybe, just maybe, the future she had fought for, one of stability, of love, of understanding, was beginning to take root in him. Later that evening, Judith arrived, a soft knock on the door announcing her presence. Ellen opened it, and Judith stepped inside, her usual professional calm tempered with a softer, almost maternal warmth. She smiled at the sight of Ellen standing in the doorway, her gaze flicking to the children playing in the yard. "It's all protected now," Judith said quietly, her voice steady as she looked around. Ellen nodded, her throat tight. The work was done. The future, for all its uncertainty, was secure. But even as she spoke the words, a shadow lingered at the edge of her thoughts. The storm had passed, But there was no certainty that peace would last. There was always a new test, a new challenge waiting just beyond the horizon. Ellen smiled, her heart still heavy but no longer as burdened. "Yes," she said, her voice steady but resolute. "It's protected now." But as the door clicked shut behind Judith, Ellen felt a fleeting sense of foreboding. The peace she had worked for was real, but so much of it was still fragile. She just hoped it was enough. Ellen sat at her desk, the weight of the final decision pressing down on her shoulders. The last of the amendments, the final clauses, everything was in place. Her hands, steady but sure, traced over the words that had become her foundation. The final update was no different than the others, yet somehow this one felt different. This one felt like the end. She read through the clauses one last time. Bailey's education trust, Logan's behavioral clause, the no contest clause for Dana, and the guardianship rules she'd put in place. The house, the inheritance, the future, all locked behind the ink of her pen. Dana was still blocked from it all, her last chance gone. Ellen wasn't angry anymore. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to do. She had sealed everything, made her choices. The words were final. Ellen's fingers tightened around the pen, the weight of the finality sinking in. Her hand paused for a moment before she pulled out a piece of stationery. The paper felt different in her fingers, softer, heavier. She hadn't planned on writing this letter, but now, as she stared at the clean white sheet, it seemed the only way to end this chapter. She wrote the letter quickly, her handwriting neat and purposeful. There was no emotion, just the facts. Dana didn't need anything more from her. Dana, the terms of the trust are final. There will be no changes. You will not contest it, nor will you have access to it. This is the last communication I will offer you. I have done everything I can for you. The rest is in your hands. Ellen. The words were blunt, cold even, but they had to be. Dana had made her choices, and so had Ellen. She folded the letter carefully, tucking it away with the rest of the documents that would never see the light of day again. The finality was liberating and suffocating all at once. There was no going back. Dana would never understand why it had come to this, but Ellen knew. She had done it to protect what remained, to protect Bailey and Logan. Later that week, Ellen sat in the front row of the middle school auditorium, her heart swelling with pride as Logan walked across the stage to receive his 8th grade diploma. The ceremony was small, just a few hundred parents and students, but to Ellen, it felt monumental. Logan, her quiet, steady grandson, was growing up. The rules she had put in place were taking root. He had done it. He was ready to face whatever came next. Ellen watched as Logan approached the microphone to shake the principal's hand, his gaze sweeping over the crowd before meeting hers. For a brief moment, their eyes locked, a silent understanding passing between them. Logan didn't smile, but there was something in his eyes that said more than words ever could. After the ceremony, as the students mingled with their families, Bailey ran over to Ellen, throwing her arms around her in a tight hug. "You still make the rules?" she said, her voice full of quiet reverence, as though she truly understood the weight of the words. The hug was warm and familiar, a promise that despite everything, they would be okay. Ellen pulled back slightly, her fingers brushing Bailey's hair away from her face. "Only the ones worth keeping," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. It wasn't just about the rules anymore. It was about something deeper. Something that would carry them through whatever came next. The future, their future, was in their hands now, and she would make sure they had the strength to hold it. As the evening wore on, Ellen's phone buzzed with a message from Judith. The final notarization had been completed. It was done. The legacy had been sealed. No more changes, no more adjustments. It was over. Ellen sat back in her chair, her eyes drifting to the framed values statement hanging on the wall. Respect first. Kindness before cleverness. Gratitude is daily. It was the same as it had always been, but it felt different now. She had done what she could. The rules had been set, the future secured. Her hand moved instinctively to her phone again, her thumb swiping over the screen to open the final document, the will. She read the last line, the one that had been waiting there for so long. My daughter said she didn't want her kids raised by old rules, so I rewrote the rules in my will. Ellen's heart squeezed, the weight of the words settling deep inside her. She hadn't just rewritten the rules.